Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a work called, are you ready for this? It's a long title, On the Efficacy and Utility of Baptism in the Case of Elect Infants Whose Parents Are Under the Covenant. As you can maybe guess from that work, it wasn't written yesterday. This is written by the Dutch Reformed theologian Herman Witsius. He would be a contemporary of figures like Wilhelmus Abrakel, who is right here on the shelf behind me, one of the great Dutch Reformed writers and pastors and theologians of the 17th century. His dates are 1636 to 1708, so he just kind of dips into the 18th century a little bit, but he's writing very much in the context of Reformed orthodoxy, or scholasticism as it's sometimes called. You can think of it as that generation of thinkers, pastors, theologians, kind of after the reformers. You have Luther and Calvin and Ecolampadius and Bucer and all of these guys who are doing their work in the 16th century as the Reformation is taking place, and you have the different branches of the Reformation being established, the Lutheran churches and Reformed churches and so forth. And in the century after that, in the 17th and 18th centuries, you begin to see what began in the 16th century kind of coming into its own, the edges being more sharply and clearly defined, and some of the discussions advancing in different ways. So Witsius is writing as kind of one of those thinkers in that second generation of reformers. And it was a time in the life of the church where a lot of the principles of the Reformation were able to be fleshed out and developed even further. A lot of the seeds that were planted by figures like Luther and Calvin and so forth, names that we may be very familiar with, began to bear more fruit. And there was lots of discussion between different camps, right? Different traditions. The Reformed writers are always talking with and about Lutherans and Roman Catholics and Anabaptists and so forth, but also more discussion and debate within those traditions as they try to figure out what it is that they believe and where the lines of orthodoxy lie on a variety of issues. And so Witsius, again, is one of those figures existing in that time period, and this work is very much reflective of that kind of context. So a couple things to say about this. First off, what I'm actually holding is a print off of this work. It's about 70 pages long. So it was written originally in 1693. So you're getting the thought of a mature thinker on this. Witsius had written a number of significant works. His Economy of the Divine Covenants, for example, I think was 1677. So this is coming, after that, towards the end of his life. And it was a little work that he wrote, which was later published with some other books, but was in Latin, as all theological discourse more or less was for many hundreds of years. And it was not translated into English until the 1850s. And so this print-off is based on that English translation from the 1850s. I think William Marshall was the name the gentleman who originally translated this and published it in a book with some other writings on baptism, trying to defend a Calvinistic Reformed view of those things. And this copy that I'm holding was kind of revisited and refreshed by J. Mark Beach, who is associated with Mid-America Seminary, and this translation, and he has a number of notes and corrections, footnotes. He's tracked down all of the sources that Witsius quotes and has a very helpful little introduction at the beginning. That was republished in the Mid-America Journal of Theology in 2006. So it's something that fortunately is kind of available for us again. One of the things I love, if you are into theology, the Mid-America Journal of Theology is one that I don't think a lot of people, at a popular level are even aware of, but it's something that if you do enjoy digging into deeper theology is a great resource, both because the quality of the articles is very high, but also they post the articles for free online. There's a lot of wonderful journals out there. Westminster Theological Journal has kind of been a mainstay, but you have to subscribe to it or pay to get access to the article. So this is just a PDF you can download for free, and I will put a link to this in the description below. So if you are interested in digging in you can, because it's freely available. Okay, so let me dive into the work. I'm really just going to kind of give an overview of what Witsius covers. I won't walk you through every line of his argument, but just kind of whet your appetite and give you enough information that you can know if this is a work that would profit you or not. So as I said, this edition or copy has a helpful introduction by J. Mark Beach, where he kind of introduces us to Witsius and covers what it is that Witsius is trying to discuss in this work. I thought he had a helpful way of framing it. He says that what Witsius is doing is tackling certain questions that theologians have always debated and discussed, but also that just pop up in the life of the church. And as you can tell from the long title, he's wanting to discuss and explore what's the efficacy, what's the effect, what's the utility of baptism, what does it do, how does it work, what's the relationship between the act of baptism and what actually happens in baptism in the case of elect infants whose parents are under the covenant. So he is assuming a paedo-Baptist position, if we want to use those categories. He's assuming infant baptism is the case, and he's exploring then what happens when, and notice the language, right, when the elect child of a believer is baptized. So he's not dealing as thoroughly with the question of what about children who maybe are not elect but are growing up in the church. He does touch on that issue, here and there throughout, but it's a bit of a narrower question. So that's an important caveat, just so you know what to expect. He's trying to tease out, okay, in those situations where God has chosen to redeem a child, and he's caused that child to be born into a covenant family, and he ordains that child would be baptized and his parents bring him for baptism, what's happening there? How do we understand what's going on? And here's how J. Mark Beach kind of captures some of the questions that flow from this whole topic. How should covenant children be regarded, he writes in the introduction. Should they be regarded as saved prior to baptism, at the moment of baptism, or sometime subsequent to their baptism? Moreover, are baptized children certainly to be saved? Should it be expected? Or is their salvation a matter of doubt, or perhaps no more than a hopeful wish beyond what might be expected of persons who cannot lay claim to the covenant promises of God? To state the question differently, are baptized children more fit or likely candidates of salvation than unbaptized children? So he spends a lot of time in this work discussing those kinds of questions, that when we look at the baptized person, the baptized child in this instance, what exactly should we understand or expect to be happening there? And how do we view that child in terms of our expectations or hopes regarding their salvation? So again, these are questions that are very, very much contemporary questions still in our circles. He also spends a good bit of time discussing baptism itself and tracing out the efficacy of baptism. Does baptism communicate the blessings that are described here? Does it confer it or convey it, and if so, in what way? And he goes through a lot of ground on that regards. Now, something that I should say here, as I was reading this work, one thing that you should definitely be aware of is it is a 17th century work. It is an example, a fruit of Reformed scholasticism or Protestant orthodoxy. And while Witsius is in many ways a good, clear writer, and he says right at the beginning, I'm writing this because these questions, the question respecting the efficacy and utility of Christian baptism in the case of elect infants of covenanted parents, is particularly difficult and abstruse, and as in former, so also in later times, has been much obscured by the subtleties of elaborate discussion. And so he says, the experienced and impartial reader must be allowed to determine whether this little work of mine is calculated to serve the purpose of clearing up this question so that the truth may be better understood and the peace of the church more firmly cemented. In other words, he's saying, this is a tough question, and there's been a lot of discussion and debate about it, and sometimes that discussion and debate has maybe raised more questions than answering questions, but he's hoping, his goal is to clear the air a little bit and deal with some of these things. I think in some ways Witsius very much succeeds in that, as I'll talk about here in a minute, but I do want you to be aware, if you're coming into this without a grounding in some of the historical and theological debates, because one of the things that he's trying to do is to kind of orient the reader to the range of positions that are out there. And that, he's talking both about the difference between Reformed views and non-Reformed views, but also differences within the Reformed tradition. And he's going to be dealing with authors and thinkers who were very significant in his time or in the generation before, but who are not well known today. So he'll interact with Calvin and Beza and some of those, but he's also quoting from a lot of, French Reformed thinkers, Dutch Reformed thinkers, Scottish theologians that are not going to be well known. And there are sometimes categories that are used that are not necessarily going to be familiar. He makes liberal use of Greek in this. The longer passages are translated, so that's not an absolute stumbling block if you don't have some Greek, but you will find yourself probably struggling through a little bit if you don't have some knowledge of languages, some knowledge of the historical debate and discussion. So if you're a really eager layperson who wants to take the time to work through this, you might very well find it helpful, but it's probably going to be most of interest to pastors or theologians or more advanced students. So what is the value of this work? Well, first off, I think it does raise and address some really important questions that I hope you can see already just kind of from the introduction or the quotations from the introduction there. These are questions that pastors face, questions that parents will ask, and so it's helpful for us as pastors, theologians, to think through these things and to be aware of how different figures in the church have answered some of these questions. And I think Witsius is helpful to kind of guide us through that discussion and give some categories that are useful. Secondly, if you're interested in kind of historical theology and seeing how thinking has developed on some of these questions, Witsius, his work really shines in that regards, because he goes through a lot of the different views, interacts with their arguments, and then will kind of assess them. So often he'll kind of lay out, hey, here's so-and-so's answer to this question. And then he'll kind of go back and say, okay, so, let's go through those scriptures. Where are they helpful? Where are they maybe missing what the scripture is actually saying? How does church history play into this? He'll interact with the church fathers a lot. And then just kind of fleshing out some of the theological or kind of systematic theology, either strengths or weaknesses that the different views provide. So Witsius very much is kind of trying to be impartial. He's trying to kind of lay out, hey, here are some questions that are big questions. Here's some different views, and here's how we can assess those views. So that adds, in one sense, a layer of complexity, again, to the popular reader, because he's not just saying, hey, here's what I think are the right answers to these questions. You've got to listen carefully to hear where Witsius is actually giving his answers, because he spends a lot of time kind of walking you through the different options. But for those who are kind of braced for what he's doing and who can track with the historical back and forth, it's very helpful, because you see not just one man's views, but you get a good kind of lay of the land of how different people have handled that. So I think it's helpful to raise some of those big questions. It's helpful to kind of walk us through, not just Witsius's views, but the broader range of those views. And part of what he's trying to do is to show not every Reformed thinker answers every one of those questions the same way. There's actually some diversity and some breadth to the Reformed tradition on some of these questions. A lot of the Dutch Reformed authors, and I think Witsius would fall into this category, would tend to say, for example, that kind of the presumption is that a covenant child who's baptized, we're going to assume is regenerate unless proven otherwise. And their expectation is that ordinarily, of course, God can do what he wants, but ordinarily that God gives the gift of regeneration to covenant children prior to their baptism. That's the kind of standard Dutch Reformed view in most regards. Others, though, and I think you find this more in Puritan and Presbyterian circles, this would certainly reflect more of my view, is that I don't really want to try to tie the act of baptism to what baptism signifies, in the sense that God could regenerate a covenant child before they're baptized, after they're baptized, or even in the moment of baptism. But he'll go through all the different views and kind of flesh out why he holds to what he holds and some of the strengths and weaknesses. So whether you agree with Witsius or not, if you do a careful reading, it'll sharpen your thinking and help you to understand why people deal with these questions in different ways. So it has a lot of use from all of those vantage points. But the last thing I wanted to sort of share was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting, but was very blessed and encouraged by. And that was just to see, not just the theological conclusions that Witsius came to, but the theological approach that he took to this whole question. Because one of the themes that he kind of stresses in his handling of this topic is the importance of what we might call irenicism. And this is a concept that is not well known and often not well respected in our day. An irenic, or someone who's being irenic or pursuing irenicism, is someone who's aiming for peace. I love Gavin Ortland's YouTube channel. He's got some really phenomenal stuff, and he'll make this point a lot, because this is very much an ethos that he strives for, and a way of doing theology that he tries to live out. And I think it's exactly right. You can see it in Bucer, you can see it in Witsius, and in many others as well. And that is a recognition that when we are doing theological discourse, when we are engaging with people who disagree with us, we want to hold the line. We want to be clear. We want to be strong. We want to be firm. We want to be careful. But we want to do it in a way that's aiming for peace. So the goal is not just to blast your opponents, right? And this is very much the mood of the present day. You see it in politics, right? You see it in theology. And a lot of the voices that are loudest and get the biggest following are the ones that are kind of the brashest, that cut away at nuance, that kind of caricature opponents, or even take those who really aren't opponents. They just have a slightly different view, but they're within the same camp, and treat them as if they're opponents. And you see this a lot, especially in online discourse. And I think in that kind of a context, Witsius's emphasis on aiming for peace, saying, I have my view, and he's very clear to critique people's views, but he's also very careful to lay out charitably what are their answers to these questions, and why are they answering it this way, and what are the strengths to what they're saying. And then he'll come in and say, here's the critique, here's why I think it doesn't stand. But he's very careful. And there's just two quotes I want to share with you. One from the beginning of this work, right on the first page, the other closer to the end, where he kind of sounds this note. I just found these quotes to be great. He says, I hold it unworthy of men professing the study of wisdom, and most of all, unworthy of theologians, if in controversial discussions they cannot make known their disagreement unless their language has a sting in it, or their ink is largely mingled with gall. To me, nothing seems more in accordance with sacred truth and solid erudition than a mild and courteous spirit. And if at any time I must enter on a debate, whether in writing or otherwise, that divine admonition of the Apostle Paul remains and ever shall remain deeply fixed in my mind, to speak the truth in love. I find that to be such a helpful emphasis, and he really does live that out in his work. And then again, at the end of the work, having kind of walked through these debates and engaged with some writers and said some strong things, but tried to do it in a charitable way, here's how he kind of brings things more towards a close at the end of his book. He says, but in the present clouded state of our understanding, let us not be angry with anyone who does not in all things see exactly as we think we see, or as, by the grace of God, we really do see. The love of truth and the spirit of charity, cultivated with equal care, constitute the most shining ornaments of a Christian, that is, of a truly noble mind. And so I think if you are someone who loves the truth and who loves the spirit of charity and who wants to cultivate those things with equal care, reading this book and others like it will help you in that. Not only to kind of navigate the particular questions about baptism and its efficacy for elect infants, but just with theology in general, because it's a great model for us of how to give equal weight to both of those things, the spirit of truth and the spirit of charity, as Witsius calls us to. So for a whole host of reasons, I think this is a useful work. Again, it's assuming a certain level of knowledge and expertise and interest that maybe not everyone is coming with. So it may not be useful for everyone, but for those who know what they're getting into, I think this could be a very helpful work on the efficacy and utility of baptism in the case of elect infants whose parents are under the covenant, by Herman Witsius. And again, I'll post a link to this if you want to read it for free in the description below.